The air inside the modest internet cafe in Tangier was thick with the scent of freshly ground coffee, overheated wires, and the faint salt carried from the nearby sea. The sound of traffic outside drifted in, bicycle bells, the distant call of a street vendor selling figs. Amina sat at a corner station, her back to the wall, eyes fixed on the glow of the screen. For 2 years, she had sent out resumes, hundreds of them. Each reply a polite rejection, or worse, silence. She had walked to countless interviews in shoes that wore thinner with every trip, smiled through endless questions, and still, nothing. But Amina's heart was stubborn. She had prayed every night, kneeling on the thin mat by her bed, her whisper merging with the hum of the city's late hours. Ya Allah, send me something worthy of my hands and my patience. That afternoon, the world seemed to pause. On the job board, a posting appeared, framed by a thin golden border. House manager, Abu Dhabi, immediate start. The words seemed to pull the air from her lungs. Salary, generous. Accommodation within royal quarters. Confidentiality, absolute. Amina clicked. At the top of the page, a crest appeared. A falcon in flight, its wings outstretched, encircled by elegant Arabic calligraphy. The Al Nahyan family, the kind of name whispered with reverence in tea houses and news broadcasts. By evening, she had rewritten her CV twice, carefully smoothing out every word. Her fingers trembled as she pressed send. 2 days later, she opened her email and felt the world tilt. Congratulations, you have been selected. Her mother's tears came first, quiet, relieved sobs. Her younger siblings pressed their faces into her dress, laughing and clinging to her hands. In the days that followed, every movement felt heavier with meaning. Folding her scarves, selling the little jewelry she had to buy the right shoes, inhaling the familiar scent of her neighborhood as if storing it for later. 4 days later, she stood at Casablanca's Mohammed V International Airport. It was her first flight. From the small oval window, the world turned to a golden-brown sea, dunes undulating beneath the afternoon sun, then to deep blue as the Gulf waters appeared. Abu Dhabi rose in the distance like a dream, white minarets piercing the sky, glass towers shimmering like blades of ice, and domes gleaming with sunlight. The airport air was heavy with the perfume of oud incense and the buzz of languages she barely recognized. A tall man in a spotless white kandura held a small ivory placard, Miss Amina El Fassi. He didn't smile, simply inclined his head, then led her outside into a waiting black SUV, whose leather seats were cool against her palms. The drive was silent. The city's glitter gave way to open desert, the road stretching endlessly under a coppery sky. Date palms lined certain stretches, their shadows flickering over her face. She wanted to ask questions, but the man's posture, straight, formal, kept her quiet. An hour later, the SUV slowed before vast wrought iron gates gilded with delicate patterns. They swung open without a sound, revealing the palace beyond. Its ivory walls were carved with geometric mosaics that caught the last light of the day. Domes rose like golden moons, and in the courtyard, marble fountains whispered over pools lit from beneath, their waters turning emerald in the glow. The vehicle stopped before the grand entrance. Amina stepped out, the warm evening air wrapping around her like a velvet shawl. Her abaya shifted gently in the desert breeze, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. She gripped the handle of her single leather bag, trying to steady her breathing, and then he appeared. Principe Khalid Al Nahyan. His presence seemed to draw the light toward him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his white kandura fell in perfect lines, and the black agal bound his headscarf with exact precision. His eyes, dark, sharp, and unreadable, met hers briefly, scanning her as though weighing something unseen. His voice was deep, clipped. His gaze lingered for a fraction too long, but without softness. Fine. She starts tomorrow. Without another word, he turned and vanished into the cool shadows of the palace's grand arched doorway. Later, in the servants' wing, Amina unpacked her modest belongings in a small, immaculate room. Whitewashed walls, cool marble beneath her feet, a single brass lantern casting warm light. In the corridor, Mariam, the older Sudanese maid, was polishing another lantern, her movements steady. Amina asked, her voice low. Mariam's eyes softened, but she kept polishing. His wife, she died last year. A car accident. The words landed heavy. He found out she had betrayed him, Mariam continued. Since then, his heart has been closed like the palace gates at night. He trusts no woman. He speaks little, smiles never. Amina nodded. She had not come for kindness. She had come for work, to send money home, to preserve her dignity. But as she lay in bed that night, the sound of the courtyard fountain drifting through the small open window, she could not shake the image of his eyes. Dark, guarded, but with something beneath, like the desert just before a storm. And the desert, she knew, had a way of changing those who dared to walk its sands. Before the first call to prayer echoed from the distant minarets, Amina was already awake. The faintest blue of pre-dawn light seeped through the narrow window of her room, spilling across the cool marble floor. She wrapped her black abaya around her and stepped into the corridor, her slippers making no sound on the polished stone. The palace was a place of silences. At this hour, the only sounds were the gentle murmur of the courtyard fountain and the rustle of palm fronds swaying in the desert breeze. Somewhere far off a falcon cried, a sharp note that seemed to slice the stillness. She began her duties in the grand majlis. Even empty, the room commanded respect. Carved cedar shelves heavy with books bound in deep brown leather, each title inlaid with gold script. Brass lanterns hanging from arched ceilings, their colored glass casting jeweled shadows. Thick carpets woven in reds and creams, soft beneath her feet. She dusted carefully, her fingertips grazing patterns that told centuries-old stories. From the majlis, she moved to the dining hall. The scent of cardamom and fresh khubz bread drifted from the kitchen, where an older cook named Samira worked in near silence. Amina prepared the prince's morning tray with deliberate care. A small dala of steaming Arabic coffee, 3 dates arranged on fine porcelain, and a glass of cool water, exactly as Mariam had taught her. In this palace, the smallest detail carried meaning, and mistakes were not easily forgotten. By the 3rd day, her duties took a turn. Mariam entered the servants' quarters holding a set of freshly pressed robes. "His Highness wants you to choose which he will wear," she said in a tone that suggested both trust and a subtle warning. The prince's wardrobe was more like a gallery, rows of kandoras in shades of white, beige, cream, grey, and deep jewel tones, each hanging in perfect order. She trailed her fingers over the fabrics, linen light as desert air, silk blends cool to the touch. Her hand paused at a pale grey kandura, the color of the sky just before the first light breaks over the dunes. When Khalid entered, the shift in the room was almost tangible. His presence carried weight. The air seemed to still around him. His eyes fell on the robe she had chosen. His voice was measured, his gaze direct. "Grey is for calm, Your Highness," she replied softly, but without hesitation. For the briefest moment, something unreadable flickered in his expression, like a shadow across water. Without a word, he took the robe and disappeared into the adjoining chamber. The next morning, she laid out a deep navy kandura. This time, his brow lifted as soon as he saw it. "Navy is for wisdom," she said, lowering her eyes slightly in respect. There was a pause. He did not comment, but his gaze lingered a heartbeat longer before he dressed. At breakfast, he placed a plate before him, fresh dates glistening like amber, slices of fig exposing their pink centers, and pomegranate seeds like scattered rubies. The steam from the coffee curled upward between them. He glanced at the arrangement, then at her. His voice carried a thread of dry amusement, but also a strange invitation. Amina allowed herself the faintest smile. "Dates are sweet, but only when ripe, like trust, which takes time. Pomegranate seeds, many, but each protected, like a man's honor." Silence settled between them, not the cold silence of strangers, but the weighted quiet of words heard and considered. He looked away first, reaching for his coffee, yet she felt the faint shift in the air. That afternoon, as she crossed the courtyard balancing a tray of fresh mint tea for the other staff, a shimmer of movement caught her eye. Through the carved arch of a second-floor window, Khalid stood in his study, a book in hand. Yet she sensed, before she even confirmed, that his eyes were on her. Not long, not openly, but just enough for a ripple of awareness to pass between them. By the end of her first week, an unspoken rhythm had formed. She did not seek conversation, yet his questions began to come, brief, precise, almost accidental. He did not thank her, yet his voice, when addressing her, carried an almost imperceptible warmth, like the desert air just before dawn. Still, Mariam's words echoed in her mind. The The palace is a place of duties, not dreams. And yet, every time his gaze met hers, it felt as if the desert wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, a promise, distant but impossible to ignore. The days that followed slid into a quiet pattern, tasks, glances, silences, but the silences no longer felt empty. They held breath, like a drum waiting for the first strike. In the afternoons, the light crossed the courtyard in long golden bands, and Amina learned the pace of the palace by the way those bands crawled along the marble. She moved through rooms as if tuning an instrument, adjusting small things no one else noticed. The angle of a lantern, the fold of a curtain that caught too much glare, a bowl of dates turned so the most perfect fruit faced the door. When she worked, she breathed more slowly, and the rooms followed her rhythm. One late afternoon, she stood in the majlis with a crystal vase in her hands, weighing the roses. White calmed the air, yes, but the sun had come in fierce that day, and the carpets blazed crimson underfoot. The room needed quiet. She trimmed the stems and slipped them into the water, fingertips catching the coolness, then placed the arrangement where the light could crown each flower without bleaching it. She felt him before she heard him. His voice came from the doorway, low and even, asking why she had chosen white. She told him, peace softened rooms. He asked what sharpened them. Red, she said, but red did not belong where one was trying to heal. The corner of his mouth shifted by a breath, not a smile, more like a thought passing behind a curtain. He left without a word, yet the scent of oud he carried lingered after him, and she stood very still, as if a string inside her had been plucked. The next morning the palace woke with the hush of a desert dawn. Before the call to prayer, she prepared the breakfast tray, counting out 3 dates, polishing the silver rim of the small glass of water, warming the dala until the cardamom bloomed. She carried the tray through a corridor where colored glass threw sapphires and rubies across the floor. In his dining room, light fell in bars across the table. He entered without ceremony, and she set the tray down without looking up. Only when she poured the coffee did he ask, almost idly, whether the fruit would recite another lesson. She did not lift her eyes. She told him that dates required ripeness, that honor was a pomegranate guarded in rubies, that a fig's softness belonged to trees with stubborn roots. The quiet that followed was not cold. It was listening. He drank, and she could hear the faint clink of porcelain against marble like a distant bell. By midweek, the palace received a delivery of new carpets. A truck backed into the courtyard, and men in dusty headscarves began to slide out the rolls. One slipped from a shoulder. Instinct moved before thought, and Amina lunged, taking the weight across her forearms. The weave burned her skin, the scent of wool and dye filling her throat. A voice from above called careful, and she looked up to find him on the balcony, arms folded, the morning sun mapping lines of shadow across the white of his kandura. Those carpets, he said, cost more than a house in Tangier. Then it is good that I caught it, she answered, and a shadow of something, amusement, surprise, crossed his face before he disappeared into the line of arches. When she straightened, the foreman was apologizing, but she barely heard him. Her pulse rolled like heat on the horizon. He summoned her to the study later, where the air was cooler and the scent of leather and ink ruled. The drapes were a deep, serious green, the kind of color that forbids noise. He gestured toward a cabinet of old letters tied in cords, the shade of tea. No one touched these, he said, and asked if she could read classical Arabic. She could. The paper was brittle in her fingers, the script elegant and small. Names surfaced like pearls through sand, dates, old addresses, a signature she did not say aloud. She set one letter back very carefully and asked whether it had been hers. The pause that followed was not indecision, it was remembering. Yes, he said. The word was clean and heavy. She did not offer comfort. She ordered the letters by subject and season, and left the corner where grief lived untouched. When she finished, the desk looked orderly, in a way that breathed rather than clenched. As she turned to go, he stopped her. You choose colors and flowers like weapons, he said. You speak of fruit as if it was scripture. Why? She met his gaze without challenge or invitation, and told him symbols speak when people cannot. Sometimes they say what we are not yet ready to hear. The air between them shifted the way heat wavers above sand. He said nothing, but the way he watched her then was different, as though a line had redrawn itself around her shape. The palace taught her its secrets in small doses. She learned which corridor cooled first, when the wind turned, which lantern hummed before its oil ran low, which falconer whistled as he crossed the inner garden at noon. She learned the rhythm of the housekeeping staff, the stride of the guards, the exact minute the fountain's pump slowed before dusk. Sometimes in the kitchen, she watched the old cook Samira fold dough and whispered the names of spices in two accents, Marekshi and Khaliji, rolling the differences on her tongue. Samira would study her with a sidelong smile and push a plate of warm flatbread toward her with a sigh that pretended annoyance. On the seventh day, the palace hosted a private luncheon for a visiting cousin and two advisors. Amina spent the morning in careful choreography. She chose linens the color of unpolished pearl, set out water in tall flutes that caught stray shards of light, arranged dates between almonds so that the pattern suggested a rising moon. In the antechamber, she paused by the wardrobe. Her hand hovered over white, then cream, then settled on a robe the deep blue of night, just before the first star appears. When he entered and saw it, his eyebrow lifted with the faintest challenge. She answered before he asked. "Wisdom," she murmured, "and mercy. A leader wears both at a table where counsel sharpens the air." For a heartbeat, a story moved behind his eyes. She saw it, a brief flash, then the mask resumed its place. He said nothing and took the garment. At the luncheon he spoke little, but his silence no longer had edges. It had intent. Twice his gaze found Amina as she refilled glasses. Twice she lowered her eyes with the same measured ease. That evening, the desert cooled. Wind combed the palms and carried the mineral scent of stone. Amina stood alone by the inner pool, while the lanterns opened their petals of colored light across the water. The moon rose thin and silver, a blade made kind by distance. If she closed her eyes, she could see Tangier's coastline and the Moroccan nights that held her childhood, the rattle of carts, the violet shade that the sea casts under street lamps, her mother's voice bending prayers into the blue. In the reflection, the palace domes floated like islands. She thought about roots and roots, about how a heart could be both soft and enduring, and wondered what the desert did to grief, whether it dried it into something that could be carried or polished it into something that could be worn. The following morning brought a quiet crisis. A call came from the charity office. The embroidered runners for the upcoming iftar, scheduled in the smaller majlis, had been delivered in the wrong color, scarlet with gold, a clash for the prince's understated palate. Panic was a shy animal, but it had already crept into the voices of the junior staff. Amina listened, then moved. She took inventory of what the palace stored in its cool cupboards, found a set of ivory runners, too plain for celebration, and paired them with narrow bands of turquoise silk borrowed from a seldom-used salon. She replaced the heavy centerpieces with tall, clear glass, mint suspended like green fireflies, and tucked single white blossoms at their base. When the light struck at noon, the tables cooled to a sea breeze calm. Mariam stood at the threshold and exhaled as if someone had set down a heavy bowl. Later, Amina noticed a small, neat note on the service ledger, in an unfamiliar hand. Acceptable solution. No signature. No flourish. The D had a particular downward flick. She set her palm over the page for a moment, not to keep the note, but to measure its temperature. Sometimes she caught him not looking at her. Not looking is a kind of look when it repeats. From the far end of a corridor, from a balcony, from the corner of a room where a stack of papers kept him company, he did not look just long enough that she knew he had. She pretended not to notice. Courtesy is a map, one must walk slowly. One afternoon she found a thin volume left by the latticed window in the servants' hallway, as if forgotten. The cover was stamped in faint gold, sayings of Al-Jahiz. Inside, a linen ribbon marked a page. She read the line without meaning to. The generous man hides his generosity in the habits of his day. She looked up, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the corridor was empty. She traced the edge of the ribbon, closed the book, and returned it to the sill. Later, when she passed again, the book was gone. The days stretched into a string of small accuracies. She learned the timbre of his footsteps against different floors, how marble made them bright, how carpet softened them. She learned that he disliked candles that smelled of anything but rose and tolerated jasmine only on warm nights. She learned that when the sky turned the color of apricots just before sunset, he walked alone along the outer colonnade where the stone held the day's heat like a living thing. Once, by accident or fate, She reached the colonnade as he did. The light made everything tender. He looked at her, not past her, and the quiet that rose between them was not awkward. It was a sheet pulled over a sleeping child. He nodded the smallest nod. She returned it. They stood for a breath in parallel silence, then walked on in opposite directions, both slower than before. By the end of the fortnight, people in the palace had begun to rearrange themselves around her competence. The younger maid came to ask which Polish kept brass from clouding after a sandstorm. The driver started waiting 3 extra minutes by the gate because she tended to arrive with a list. The steward learned that if she requested 6 of anything, exactly 6 would be needed. These are not grand victories, but palaces are built on the discipline of small, invisible hands. She found solace in the unnoticed rightness of things. And still, the rhythm between them lengthened, chords stretching but not snapping. He asked for her judgment on fabrics and flowers, not with humility, but with a new curiosity, as if testing the way her mind laid bridges between sense and symbol. She answered without ornament, trusting the weight of simple words. When she left a room, he sometimes remained very still, like a man listening for the echo of a dropped pin. At night she lay awake and heard the desert move, a music made of nothing but air and memory, and she understood that change often arrives the way dawn does, so slow that only the shadows notice first. The evening came down like silk, heat loosening its hold on the stones and leaving the courtyards perfumed with wet jasmine and cooling marble. Amina finished setting the table in the small dining room reserved for nights when the palace wished to be quiet. She placed a bowl of pomegranate seeds where the light could find them and turned them to embers, poured water until pearls of condensation gathered on the glass, and left a single white blossom by the plate, as if peace could be placed down and asked to stay. She was turning to go when his voice arrived behind her, low and unforced, like a door opened without a creak. "Sit." She had expected to be dismissed. The word rearranged the room. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, eyes lowered, the rules of distance moving through her like a second spine. He took his seat opposite, looked not at the food, but at the small flame of the candle, then lifted the dalla and poured his own coffee, a gesture so rare she glanced up in reflex. She said she was going to the market, he began, as if continuing a conversation that had once been interrupted and had waited months in the air. No makeup, casual clothes. Amina listened. The candle lifted and fell in the tiny winds of their breathing. I received a call from the hospital. Accident. His gaze did not move. Only his jaw remembered to tense, then release. I arrived and learned she hadn't been alone. If grief had hands, it would have taken me by the throat. I kept thinking, what does this make me? Her voice, when it came, was soft enough that it did not disturb the careful balance of the table. It makes you a man who loved deeply. He let the words hang, studying the pale ribs of their meaning, as if holding them to the light. My grandmother sold spices in the souk, she said, and a smile barely warmed her mouth. She taught me to taste with patience, silence again, but the kind that arranges chairs, invites someone to stay longer. His shoulders loosened a fraction. He ate without noticing he had started, as if the appetite had belonged to the memory, and not to the man. When she rose to clear the plates, his fingers brushed the rim of the dish she carried. Not accident, not intention, just the first soft admission that proximity did not burn. In the days that followed, something yielded. He called her less with orders and more with questions. In the study, he asked which letter opener cut without tearing. In the wardrobe, if ivory read as too ceremonial for a meeting that needed humility. In the garden, whether lanterns of smoked glass would make guests quieter in their conversations. She answered simply, and he watched the way her answers traveled through the palace and changed its temperature. One afternoon, a sand-laden wind rose without warning and pressed the sky close to the domes. The courtyard turned the color of old papyrus. Even the fountains seemed to whisper under breath. Amina crossed the inner garden to secure the shutters, her sleeves freckled with dust, when she met Khalid returning from the outer colonnade. He lifted a hand, wait, and moved ahead of her to the latch. In the brief space they shared in the archway, the storm sang against the palace like fabric scraped by a blade. He set the bar in place and looked at her as if to make sure the wind had not taken any part of her with it. You should not be in the corridors when the sand rises, he said, but the admonition was a disguise for worry. Things blow loose, she replied. The words arrived too quickly. He tempered them. After the storm fell away, The air felt washed and new, leaving light like clean linen draped over every surface. In the evening, the staff drifted into the lesser majlis to drink mint tea and count small damages. Amina brought a tray to the garden workers who had spent the day fighting grit from the drains, men smelling of sun and metal, laughter a bit too loud now that the wind had stopped. Among them, Kareem, the youngest, a quick smile and hands that moved in bright circles when he spoke. He thanked her with nervous energy, and when she insisted they take the last glass, he grinned in the open way of men who have not yet learned the cost of being seen. Across the courtyard, at the shadowed mouth of a corridor, a figure paused. White robe, unhurried stance, a stillness that listened on more than one frequency. He turned away before she could feel the weight of his gaze, but the air held a faint afterimage as if a bird had winged through and brushed the surface of a pond. That night, the palace exhaled. Amina finished folding linens in the service room, her fingers finding the calm in repetition, and carried a file of inventory notes to the study. He was there, reading, the lamp gilding the planes of his face and leaving his eyes dark as wells. She placed the folder down and would have withdrawn, but he said her name as if testing how it sounded when not hidden among instructions. He asked. "Caution keeps the floor from breaking," she answered. He leaned back, as if struck by the geometry of the thought. "Amina," he said again, and her name did a small, bright thing to the space between them. He stood, circled the desk, and stopped at a distance that did not require either of them to pretend indifference. "Then don't try to be," she said. "Be honest." His hands opened, empty, then closed again against the habit of control. "There are many rooms in which I keep myself." He hesitated. "I've had practice," she said, and a memory of Tangier's salt and narrow stairs rose and dimmed. He looked at her for a long moment, as if reading a letter written in careful script and deciding whether to answer it. "The palace is always listening," she said, and it coaxed a breath that was almost a laugh from him. "Then let it hear this," he replied. Would you stay a moment?" The request was so simple it unstitched something. She sat on the low sofa. He took the opposite end and did not lean back, as if to lean would be to fall. They spoke little. Once he asked what the smell of the rain in Tangier was called, and she told him petrichor, but in the mouths of her neighbors it was simply mercy. They stayed until the lamp clicked and cooled, and when she rose to go, he stood with her but did not reach for anything. Not her hand, not the distance. The restraint was a kind of courtesy she had not expected. The next day, the palace recovered its ordinary choreography, but the set had shifted a fraction. In the wardrobe, when she chose a robe the shade of dune shadow, he did not ask why. He only looked as if the answer had been given in a previous life. In the dining room, when she set the fruit, he did not ask for a lesson. He ate the pomegranate seeds slowly, the way a man reads a line twice. Near sunset, she carried fresh towels toward the bathhouse that adjoined the gardens. Kareem rounded the corner with a bundle of tools over his shoulder. He nearly collided with her, stepping back so quickly a wrench clattered to the floor and made a sharp, embarrassed sound. He apologized, then apologized for apologizing, and when she laughed, only a breath, only to ease the awkwardness. He looked at her as men do when they discover warmth and mistake it for invitation. He said something kind, clumsy in its admiration. She inclined her head in thanks and kept moving. A ribbon pulled free before it could not. On the far side of the colonnade, Khalid was walking with an advisor, absorbing figures and schedules with the absent accuracy of a mind that counts even while weathering something else. The advisor followed his gaze and also saw what the prince had seen. It was nothing, and yet it pressed on the prince's composure like a thumb on a bruise. He did not change step. He did not blink differently. But the advisor, trained by years of reading men who ruled, registered a note gone sharp and filed the information in a careful drawer where such things are stored for later use. That evening, the sky thinned to a pale blade, and a single star hung over the desert, like a pin through silk. Amina finished her rounds, and, on impulse, carried a small tray to the study. Coffee, 3 dates, slices of pear arranged like crescent moons. He looked up when she entered. The tiredness around his eyes had softened, as though it too had been allowed to exhale. He considered the plate, then the space between them. She met his gaze, and found there no performance, only the honest gravity of a vow spoken as lightly as a promise to keep breathing. The moment did not ask for more. She felt the room change shape around those few words, as if the walls had learned a new angle to hold them. Later, When the palace gone quiet enough that footsteps could be counted by room, she passed the inner courtyard and saw the reflection of the moon broken into silver coins by the fountain's ripples. Somewhere beyond the arches, a falcon rustled in its hood, impatient to be loosed at dawn. The air smelled faintly of rose. She stood very still and let the night map itself onto her skin. Change does not arrive like trumpets, she thought. It arrives like water ascending a wick, quiet, steady, inevitable. Behind her, out of sight, a tall figure paused at the threshold and watched the way the lamplight gathered on the curve of her cheek and then relinquished it to shadow. He said nothing. He returned to the corridor, carrying with him the inconvenient discovery that peace, which he had once locked in a room and thrown the key from a moving car, had found its way back into the palace wearing the quiet of a woman who understood how to set a table so that even grief remembered its manners. And far off in the servants' quarters, where laughter uncoils after long days, a simple comment passed from mouth to mouth. The prince has begun to speak softly again. It was not gossip. It was the sound of a household adjusting its footing, sensing the slight tilt that precedes a larger turn. The morning light came in hard and white, bouncing off the marble like a blade's flash. Heat shimmered in the courtyard air, and the watered earth released the faint, clean scent of soil just before it dries. Karim bent over a bed of desert lilies, trimming browned leaves with the careful precision of a calligrapher, finishing the last stroke of a verse. Amina crossed the courtyard with a silver tray balanced easily on one palm, the cups and pot chiming faintly against each other. Her steps were measured, eyes following the patterned tiles that led toward the smaller majlis. Karim straightened, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and stepped just into her path, not close enough to touch, but enough to break the neat rhythm of her mourning. "Those lilies," he said, his smile quick and confident. "They bloom better when someone talks to them." Amina adjusted her grip on the tray. His laughter came too loud for the quiet hour, and though she passed him without pause, the sound clung to the air behind her like a fragrance that didn't belong. From the upper balcony, Khalid stood in conversation with an advisor about land contracts. His words never faltered, yet his gaze had drifted to the scene below. Karim leaning forward, Amina's posture tightening. The moment lasted only seconds, but when the advisor finally left, Khalid remained at the railing, his eyes resting on the lilies, as if their petals might open to reveal a truth. By midday, the light dimmed beneath the approach of a narrow sandstorm, one of those sudden tempests that arrive without warning, full of grit and gust, and vanish just as quickly. The garden staff moved with urgent purpose, covering tools and leading the falcons back to shelter. Passing through on her way to the laundry, Amina stopped to help secure the linen awnings over the fountains. The wind caught the fabric, snapping it like a sail, and strands of hair slipped loose from her veil, brushing her cheek. Karim appeared at her side, offering to take over. She declined, but he stepped closer anyway, reaching for the same rope she held. The storm coughed a sharp gust, and the awning pulled hard. They both braced against it, hands almost touching. It was only a breath, nothing more, except that Mariam, the head of the servants' quarters, happened to be passing. Her gaze swept over them in a glance that took in more than it revealed. She said nothing, only gathered the folds of her abaya and walked on. Later, in the kitchen, her voice bent low over a pot of simmering cardamom tea. "The prince's eyes are sharp." The words moved quietly, but like spice, their presence grew stronger with time. That evening, the palace prepared for a private dinner with 2 foreign envoys. Amina arranged the seating in the long dining hall, candles lit low, so the gold filigree on the walls glowed softly. Khalid entered in robes of deep brown, the trim of gold catching each flicker of light. His gaze passed over the table settings, the flowers, and then settled on her. Not an open stare, but one that held still, as if to frame the image for later. "You moved the envoy from Yemen closer to me," he said. "Yes," she replied. The rest of the evening unfolded in the careful rhythm of politics, smiles thin as parchment, phrases layered with meanings. Yet more than once, Khalid's thoughts returned to the image of her in the storm, sleeves drawn tight by the wind, hair loosened against her cheek, the awning straining above her like a ship's sail. By the next morning, something in the palace air had shifted. Conversations broke off when she entered certain rooms. Karim's greetings became shorter, his eyes flicking toward the upper floors before resting on her. Even Mariam's tone carried a sweetness too heavy to be kindness. Near midday, Khalid summoned her to the study. The curtains were drawn, muting the sun to a warm amber glow that floated in the dust motes above his desk. He held a document but was not reading it. "You've been in the gardens," he said, not a question. "I passed through them," she answered. "No. Good. Lilies are fragile." She inclined her head, masking the flicker of heat his words stirred. Leaving the study, she found the corridor narrower than she remembered, the light harsher on the marble. Somewhere beyond the walls, the desert wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that might never reach the palace. That night, she lay awake, the ceiling above her seeming heavier, the silence thicker. She thought of Tangier's streets after a storm, when the gutters run fast, sweeping away whatever had been left loose. Here, in this place of marble and measured words, the current was slower, but she could feel it beginning to pull. By late afternoon, the palace seemed to draw in its breath and hold it. Doors that once stood open now leaned against their frames, as though listening. Conversations shrank into murmurs, careful not to spill into the corridors, and the falcons in the mews shifted restlessly on their perches, leather jesses tapping wood in quick, irritated beats. Even the fountains seemed to hush, the sound of falling water reduced to a soft, secret trickle. Amina felt it in the marble beneath her sandals. The cool brightness had lost its welcome, now more mirror than floor, reflecting every movement too clearly. She moved with quiet precision, each step deliberate. In the smaller majlis, she replaced the wick in a brass lantern, polished the rim until it caught a thin line of light from the window, then straightened a cushion whose corner had curled under itself. The scent of oud from the morning still lingered in the air, softened now to a memory. As she lifted the tray to leave, 2 junior maids entered, skirts whispering across the floor. One whispered something quick, stopped mid-word when their eyes met, then smiled too widely. Amina let them pass without a word, but their glance clung to her like the faint sting of sand on skin, small, but enough to scratch if left too long. Outside, the late light had turned pale and thin. Karim was crouched near the lilies, repairing a broken terracotta border. His shirt stuck to his back, damp from the heat. When he saw her, relief crossed his face, though it was shadowed by worry. "You shouldn't be out here," he murmured. "I have work in every room," she said.
"He watches everything." He hesitated, then reached to brush a smear of clay from her sleeve. The touch was brief, but felt, and the air between them changed. From somewhere close, the sound of a gate latch broke the stillness. A pair of footsteps passed over stone. Mariam's silhouette appeared in the archway. She didn't pause, didn't turn, but Amina knew the image had been taken, stored like a pearl that might later be shown at the right moment.
At dusk, a summons came. His Highness requested the evening service in the East Loggia. She prepared the tray with careful hands. Coffee in the gold-rimmed cups, slices of pear and figs arranged as if on a painter's plate, a sprig of mint resting in crystal. The loggia opened toward the desert, where the horizon glowed like molten brass before cooling into the purple of night. Khalid stood at the balustrade, hands clasped behind him, gaze fixed on the shifting edge between sand and sky. She set the tray down, and a soft wind rose, lifting the edge of her veil so it brushed her cheek. He didn't turn immediately. When he did, his eyes carried questions he had already decided not to ask. "You were in the garden again," he said. "I passed through. Roots are for work." Silence filled the space like a carpet unrolled for a guest. He picked up a slice of pear, studied it for a moment. "Wait can be learned," she replied. He told her she'd be seen less in the gardens, she asked. "For the palaces," he said, though the answer felt heavier than that. The next morning, her duties kept her indoors. When she crossed the garden with a bundle of linens, Karim kept to the far path. "I'll keep away," he said. "Then don't feed it," she replied. Later, Khalid summoned her to the study. The curtains filtered sunlight into warm amber. Motes of dust floated in the stillness. "This house is glass," he said. "You can't close eyes." Something unspoken passed through his expression. "You will take your meals in the staff salon, then be one," she said. That evening, the palace hosted a reception. Amina moved among the guests like part of the decor, seen but unseen. She noted the aunt with a ring heavy as a judgment, the advisor whose smile was all mouth, the cousin's wife whose gaze flicked away too quickly. Karim was absent. His duties shifted to the outer gates. The falconer passed with a hooded bird, its feathers trembling faintly under the leather. He caught her eye and dipped his head, a wordless recognition that in some places, loyalty could only be expressed in silence. Later, crossing the courtyard, she found Khalid in the archway, the lamplight gilding the lines of his robe. "I have moved 3 pieces," he said. "Sometimes the board learns." "I see you," he said. When she returned to her room, a folded scrap lay under the door. "Keep to the lit corridors. M." She read it twice, a faint smile breaking the tightness in her chest. In this palace, mercy came in quiet notes, never in speeches. Outside, the wind shifted over marble and garden, and somewhere in the darkness, the lilies waited for the hour they would let go of their petals. The note lay on the small wooden table beside her bed, its fold precise, the ink slightly smudged where her thumb had pressed too long. Amina had read it before closing her eyes, and again with the first light. "Keep to the lit corridors." The words felt less like caution and more like a map sketched in the margin of a larger hidden chart. She slipped the paper beneath the edge of her mirror and tied her veil, listening to the palace wake. Trays chiming, water moving through old pipes, the far-off soft thunder of carts rolling over stone. The light that morning came through the mashrabiyah screens, sharper than usual, making latticed quilts across the floor and revealing motes hanging in the air like suspended questions. In the servants' hall, 2 women from the embroidery rooms hushed mid-laughter as Amina passed. A guard at the inner gate nodded without lifting his eyes. She remembered that sensation from Tangier, how talk tightens streets, how doors sound different when they close on gossip. By mid-morning, she was aligning tall bronze lanterns in the grand hall for the emir of Al Dhafra's visit. The lanterns smelled of polish and heat. Their pierced metal skin cast fine constellations on the marble when a sunbeam touched them. Khalid appeared in the far archway, dressed in a thobe the color of evening sea, conferring under his breath with a minister. Even at that distance, his gaze found her. The minister withdrew. Khalid crossed the length of the hall without haste. Power does not need speed. "You took the lit corridor," he said. Something unreadable moved behind his eyes. Then he shifted a lantern by the smallest measure. He left the sentence behind like a tassel, to sway in the airflow of her thoughts. The day unrolled like silk, smooth, then snagging on knots. Karim avoided her in the servants' courtyard, his stride trimmed of its usual swing. In the pantry, Mariam signed for linen deliveries with neat strokes, her voice flat enough to pass as neutral. The reply arrived as a glance, and the first guard's mouth thinned shut. By afternoon, heat rose in a pale shimmer over the domes, and a sandstorm gathered without ceremony. The sky lowered, grit moved like breath. Lanterns were lit early. Amina braced a shutter in the east veranda, feeling the bars give a fraction, and then hold. The storm scratched along the palace as if searching for purchase. Khalid stepped inside, drawing the door closed with his shoulder. The cedar of his bisht pressed a dark scent into the hot, dusty air. "You should be inside," he said. For a moment, wind filled the distance between them. He reached past, hand grazing hers as he fixed the last bolt. "Stay where the light is," he said, and she heard what sat inside the sentence. Not command, not plea, but the shape of care constrained by stone. The storm emptied itself by evening. The next day, the inner courtyard was dressed for a luncheon. White linens, brass platters heavy with dates and figs, almonds in honey. Small pyramids of pistachio sweets dusted the color of new leaves. Oud music braided the heat into something almost cool. Amina poured coffee, water, coffee. Khalid sat at the head of the table. Across from him, the emir's niece wore emerald silk that caught sun like fish scales. Her bracelets chimed when she lifted her hand. So did her glances. When Amina approached, the niece's eyes weighed her with the quiet precision of a jeweler. After the luncheon, Amina paused in the side garden, under a lattice where bougainvillea spilled a ragged, beautiful red. Mariam appeared beside her, shadow first, then voice. "You walk carefully," she said. "In this house," Mariam answered, "welcome is not given." That night, when the palace sank into its cooler self, Amina stood at her window and watched the city scatter its lights like coins. The echo of the call to prayer came veiled by distance. She thought of lit corridors and shadowed ones, of storms full of dust and those that begin as whispers in rooms with closed doors. Survival, she decided, is part lamp, part memory of the path when the lamp goes out. A knock, soft and deliberate. A page held a sealed envelope, the falcon crest pressed deep. Inside, there are eyes tonight in the garden. If you must pass, take the jasmine path. No signature, only the particular slope of the D she had come to recognize. She did not plan to cross the garden. Later, carrying a covered dish to the upper kitchen, she saw shapes where there should have been only air, men leaning as watchers lean. She turned without pausing toward the jasmine path. The blossoms breathed their perfume into the dark. Pale petals held a quiet light. Footsteps did not follow. When she reached the kitchen, she found Mariam rinsing a copper pan slow enough to be waiting. No words, a look that held thanks, worry, experience. Dawn rose the color of unripe apricots. In the mews beyond the inner garden, the falcons woke restless. Their hoods sat like small crowns. Their talons clicked wood in absent thought. Amina carried water to the falconer, who'd injured his wrist in yesterday's wind. The birds were magnificent even in stillness, a logic of bone and feather shaped for sky. They know when eyes are on them, the falconer said, watching Amina watch. She offered her forearm. He smiled at the audacity and adjusted the thick glove around her wrist. The falcon stepped, light, heavier than light, a judgment. Its weight surprised her, then settled into equilibrium. Do not lie to him with your body, the falconer said. Later, in the service corridor, two junior maids pretended not to be startled by a falcon feather tucked behind Amina's ear. Bold, one murmured. Or foolish, the other replied. But the word did not fit. She slid the feather into her pocket, thinking of weight, of birds, of trays, of words that bruise when carried wrong. By mid-morning, a meeting of the council gathered in the great majlis. Amina entered with a tray of water and coffee. The room glowed with old wealth, mosaics cool as thought, carpets that remembered feet. Sheikha Mariam, Khalid's aunt, sat at the far end, posture straight as a spear. Her pearls were large, each one a small moon caught in daylight. The councillors' robes were trimmed with status, their faces with habit. Staff movements, said one advisor, a man whose teeth showed only when the conversation turned. We recommend a rotation. Amina poured carefully. Preserve what, she wondered? Truth or the illusion of it? She set a glass before the Sheikha, whose hand lingered at the rim as if claiming not the water but its servant. Khalid lifted his eyes. Efficiency is served by trust, the advisor answered. A quiet passed through the room like a sand shadow. The Sheikha's pearls clicked once against each other. Our house has weathered winds, she said, voice soft as old linen. Amina did not look up. She filled another glass. The tray felt heavier. Khalid's thumb brushed the paper beneath his hand, a list of names, duties, routes. He slid a new schedule forward, one that kept Amina in interior halls, too transparently protective to be chance, too measured to be rash. The Sheikha's gaze held steady. To an untrained eye, nothing moved. To anyone else, everything had shifted. Inshallah, she murmured. When the council ended, Amina withdrew into the corridor with the quiet of a person who has learned to open space around herself. She exhaled only by the fountain, where the sound agreed to cover her. She thought of pearls, beauty made by irritant, perfection wrapped around hurt. Afternoon brought a charity gala in the West Hall, guests in vaulted light, cut crystal, waiters streaming like comets. Amina's world narrowed to trays and temperatures, but her mind visited other rooms. The council, the Sheikha's pearls, the way a falcon weighs you before he flies. In the second hour, a protocol officer hissed that a runner was missing from the emir's table. Amina scanned the hall. Too much red, too much gold, heat rising. She pulled two narrow turquoise silk bands from a side salon and a pale ivory runner from storage, pairing them to cool the table like shadow over water. When Khalid approached minutes later with the emir's niece on his arm, the niece smiled at the arrangement as if she'd ordered it. Your taste, she said to Khalid, in a voice meant to bloom. It belongs to the house, Khalid replied. And in that answer, Amina heard the kindness of protection disguised as protocol. Music shifted, and a recitation began, poetry low as prayer. Amina moved along the edges, refilling, vanishing. The matron's reply was a shrug that could cut. The words did not pierce so much as settle, like grit at the seam of the heart that would someday be smoothed by time, or not. Near sunset, In the service passage behind the hall, Amina found Karim arguing with a steward in a whisper too sharp to be called quiet. "I only brushed dust. There was nothing in it," he said, and shame reddened his neck. The steward's hands spoke impatience. Amina paused at the corner. Karim saw her and dropped his eyes. Later, as the gala thinned, Khalid stood in the arch that led to the colonnade. The sky was a theater of copper and wine. Amina approached with a final tray. They did not speak until the silence felt laid, not empty. "I moved 3 more pieces," he said, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Boards are stubborn," she answered. He turned then, not fully, but enough for the evening to draw a fine line along his cheek. "You are not dust's enemy," he said. Night cooled the stone. The falcons slept with their hoods on, dreaming perhaps of thermals and prey. Amina finished in the pantry, her fingers finally still. When she stepped into the servants' corridor, the lamps burned low. The jasmine path pulsed faintly beyond the arch, a suggestion of light. A figure detached from the wall ahead, the protocol officer whose smile always stopped before it started. "You will sign this," he said, producing a paper that named corridors, hours, boundaries. She read quickly. It declared her roots a matter of record and accused no one, which is a way of accusing someone. "I will bring this to Mariam," she said. He blocked halfway, then stepped aside. Not enough to be kindness, just enough to keep his hands clean. Mariam was waiting in the salon with a ledger open. She took the paper, scanned it, then folded it into her book as if it were a pressed leaf. "I will answer this," she said. Amina did not argue. Sleep arrived late, soft as a nearing tide. She woke before the call to prayer, to a palace held in the pause between breaths, morning unfurled with rituals. In the mews, the falconer gestured her forward again. Today the bird's weight belonged to her body, as if it had learned her intent overnight. "He trusts the glove," the falconer said. "Trust is not love." She laughed once, quietly. It felt like a small window opening, and fed the bird a measured reward. The curved beak took it cleanly. The eyes stayed ancient and impersonal. Lesson received, lesson given. Not an hour later, a summons. The Sheikha requested coffee in the blue salon. Amina entered with the tray steady, her mind lighter than her hands. The room was a lake of cool, blue tiles, blue silk, a glass bowl of water lilies breathing pale light. She set the cups, poured. The Sheikha accepted her coffee with a nod, as fine as a signature. "You have been spoken of," the Sheikha said, as if remarking on weather. "The palace is a mouth. I am hard to swallow," Amina replied, before sense could tug her words back. She kept her eyes on the water lilies. Their stems were strong, their faces calm. The Sheikha's pearl earring ticked against her cup. "Good," she said, after a time that could have been mercy. She placed the cup down. "We are fond of Khalid." It was not a threat. It was a boundary sketched in gold leaf. Amina bowed her head. "I do not know how to break him," she said. The Sheikha's mouth made something that was not yet a smile. She lifted her hand, and the audience ended in the old way, with lightness and a door that never slammed. By afternoon, the palace settled into a clearer order. The protocol officer's paper returned, stamped not with censure, but with procedure, her routes paired, her duties named with courtesy, sharpened into law. The message was crisp. The house protects itself by protecting those within it, and will be seen to do so. A rumor is not a policy. Neither, however, is love. Evening lowered itself like a silk canopy. In the library, Amina set books to rights, a soft architecture of titles and spines. Khalid entered without sound, then did not pretend he had not come for the sight of her among words. "You saw my aunt," he said. "A glass by an open door," Amina answered. He nodded, absorbing the metaphor like a thirsty root takes water. "I have spent a year living in one room of myself," he said. It had bars on the windows. "Now I walk the corridor," he said, barely smiling. She placed a book on the shelf and did not turn. "Be careful with doors," she said softly. Some open to courtyards. He took the last step that courtesy allowed. They stood with a page between them, written in the old script of restraint. "Amina," he said, only her name, but it sounded like a vow taught to a child and remembered at the edge of a cliff. "Newness is not a costume," she said. When she looked up, their eyes met in the small, unoccupied country between need and permission. He lifted a shawl from the arm of a chair and, in a gesture more intimate than any touch, settled it around her shoulders, covering no skin his hand should not cover, warming an air he had chilled with caution. She inhaled. The fabric smelled faintly of rose and cedar, and the arithmetic of 1,000 touches by women who had passed through this room and left their breath behind. It would have been easy to step closer. He did not. Outside, the desert arranged its night. In the courtyard, the fountain cast a constellation onto the ceiling and gathered it back again. A falcon shifted in his sleep, dreaming perhaps of sky. Very late, a final scene to seal the day. A quiet disturbance near the Jasmine path. Voices like matches struck and blown out. The protocol officer, a steward, Kareem, pulled together by the magnet of a story gaining spine. Khalid arrived not with guards, but with the slow authority of a man who knows walls will move to accommodate his step. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He asked questions that landed like grains of sand, singly harmless, together forming a dune. The officer and the steward. Why was the gardener posted near the inner path after hours? Silence. The word tilted under its own weight. Khalid turned to Kareem. "You will be reassigned to the date groves at dawn," he said. To the officer, "Protocol exists to protect. No humiliation, only consequence." He dismissed them and remained with the Jasmine breathing at his back. Amina had kept her distance. He saw her anyway, as one sees a star out of the corner of the eye. "I am the careful hand," he said, almost to the air. "Then do not clench," she replied. He laughed then, quietly, a surprised human sound in a house that had forgotten the register. When she finally returned to her room, she found another scrap under the door, Mariam's tight script. "The corridor is lit. Walk." Amina sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the fatigue she had worn like armor. She laid the new note beside the first. 2 slips of paper, 2 pieces on a board that pretended not to change. She lay down. Through the window, the desert gave the night back its stars one by one. Somewhere, beyond the lattice and the fountains and the small poems of routine, a crescent moon lifted itself like a silver boat. The lilies, in their patience, in their discipline, released their petals on schedule, trusting the air, and sleep, at last, came like rain that had remembered its promise. Dawn broke in a pale wash. The color of milk poured into tea, and the palace breathed as if waking from a shallow sleep. Amina rose before the first call to prayer, fingers finding the small notes she kept tucked in the edge of her mirror. The warning from Mariam, the terse message that had once guided her along the Jasmine path. Paper remembers what breath forgets. She touched them briefly and began the day. In the kitchens, cardamom warmed the air. Samira lifted her chin at Amina's entrance, eyes quick with knowledge she did not spend easily. Amina understood. Some gifts arrive wrapped in debt. By mid-morning, the West Hall was a choreography of light and linen. She set low bowls of dates near tall glasses of water, arranged mint so its shadow cooled the table, checked the lantern chimneys for the invisible haze of oil. The protocol officer hovered with a list that kept finding new lines. He spoke in the tone of a man who believes paper can anchor rumor, unaware that rumor swims. Khalid passed through with an advisor, paused at the threshold, and took in the room with a single sweep, a measure, not a judgment. His gaze brushed Amina and then returned without haste, as if acknowledging the current that moved the surface of the pool without naming the wind. When the advisor drew him onward, he adjusted a lantern by an inch, the way he had in the grand hall, and Amina felt the small mercy of it settle. Midday arrived like a held note. The philanthropists wore silk that remembered other rooms and perfumes that tried to drown the smell of the sea. They spoke of clinics and schools, of scholarships like strings tied to invisible fingers. Sheikha Mariam attended in a gown the color of old pearls. Her presence cooled the room without dimming it. Amina poured coffee, collected cups, and learned faces. The man who noticed nothing but watched everything. The woman whose praise kept its claws. At the second course, a crystal goblet fractured with a sound like the first crack in ice. 3 heads turned, one toward Amina. The protocol officer's mouth shaped an apology in her direction, a gesture that looked like mercy but felt like aim. Amina stepped to replace the glass before the suggestion hardened, moving as if she were simply finishing what had begun before anyone looked. Khalid's hand stilled on the table. The Sheikha's pearls touched each other gently, an almost inaudible signal. No one said her name, which is another way of saying it. When the luncheon ended, the room released its breath. Amina supervised the quiet undoing of the scene. In the service corridor, the protocol officer approached with that crisp sheet of neutrality. She turned away before her voice could acquire edges. In places like this, edge is a luxury one pays for twice. Afternoon thinned into the longueurs of a palace between obligations. In the mews, the falcons mantled and relaxed, their hoods turning them into thoughts with feathers. The falconer, wrist bandaged, nodded Amina toward the glove. The bird stepped onto her arm, heavier than grace, lighter than fear. "He knows your pulse now," the falconer said. She didn't. The rhythm between them steadied, a shared compromise between sky and bone. A page found her near the fountain with a message sealed in wax the color of dusk. "Library, at second lantern." The hand was Khalid's, its discipline revealed in the decisive tale of each letter. She waited until the shadows found their mark, then went. The library was already a twilight of paper. He stood by the window, not framed but softened, a figure taught by caution to occupy only the necessary amount of air. He did not ask her to sit. He did not move closer. These were his courtesies, the ones he had learned to use the way a man learns to hold a blade by the hilt and not the edge. "They've asked for a report on routes," he said, meaning her footsteps mapped into a document. She said, "That you work," he answered. He paused, the moment bending toward confession and then away. "Mirrors are for those who cannot bear to look out," she said. The corner of his mouth thought of smiling, and then remembered itself. He gestured to a book open on the table, Sayings of Al-Jahiz, its ribbon marking a line she recognized. The generous man hides his generosity in the habits of his day. He didn't say he'd left it once for her to find. She didn't say she'd known. Some truths are kept unspoken to let them breathe. A knock at the door's shoulder broke the room without entering it. Khalid's attention shifted into its public form. He nodded to Amina, and she left by the second door, the one that always smelled faintly of cedar and old leather. In the corridor, she passed the representative, a woman in a bisht of pale gold, gaze sharp with the kind of intelligence that measures harm before help. Their eyes met, and in the half-second between them, a respect formed. Pain recognizes its antidotes. Evening brought a private majlis for poetry. The reciter's voice slid like water over stone, telling of moons that lost their way and deserts that remembered them back. Amina hovered at the edge of sound, learning how grief can ride a rhythm without showing its teeth. When the gathering ended, the courtyard held a crescent like a silver scythe above the palm fronds. Somewhere, Jasmine rewrote the air. On her way back to the servants' wing, she caught two unguarded sentences floating in the stairwell. "If it becomes necessary to move her," the first said. The second voice made a shape of care and called it procedure. She did not stop. Procedure is what a house uses to teach a lesson without admitting the subject. The following morning began with a small accident and a larger accusation. A platter of sugared almonds, carried too quickly by a junior maid, slid and scattered over the patterned tiles. The protocol officer appeared as if conjured, pen already hungry for names. He looked from the almonds to Amina, and Amina to the almonds. "I was in the north corridor," she said. Mariam materialized from a side door with a ledger open to the exact page that marked it so. "North corridor," Mariam repeated, ink as witness. The protocol officer's pen hesitated, and then bit his paper elsewhere. He left. Mariam shut the ledger with a sound like a small door closing on a larger room. "That one," Amina said. "That one," Mariam agreed. "He catches dust and calls it proof." Late morning found Amina assigned to the rose courtyard outside the blue salon. The Sheikha had requested coffee. The blue salon was a cool lake of color and restraint. Even voices lowered to meet it. Amina entered with the tray, poured, and waited a fraction longer than necessary. The Sheikha's eyes, which could rake a room and not leave footprints, rested on Amina. "You have been spoken of," the Sheikha said, the way a weatherwoman might say the wind had changed. "I am difficult to swallow," Amina answered, unadvisedly honest. She kept her gaze on the water lilies in the shallow glass bowl. "Good," the Sheikha said. She lifted her cup, pearls speaking softly against porcelain. "I do not know how to break him," Amina replied. A stillness opened in the conversation, the kind that offers a choice between kindness and test. The Sheikha chose a little of both. "You will oversee the inner courtyard tonight," she said. "The lights will fail for a moment. by design. When evening came, heat retreated into the stone, and the courtyard dressed itself in lamps like a necklace. Guests arrived, a quieter tier of importance, the ones who make decisions and prefer not to be seen doing it. Music threaded the columns. Amina placed candles where the breeze would make them seem to breathe. At the appointed time, the lamps went out. Dark held the room for a beat too long. Someone laughed, then stopped when laughter had no company. A murmur rose. A plate leaned and found the floor with a flat crack. In the charcoal hush, Amina heard the palace's bones, the fountain's steady fall, the quickening of the falcons in the mews beyond, the measured breath of a man who does not panic because he trained it not to. She moved in the map inside her body, 3 steps to the left for the first candle, a reach past the potted citrus for the tinderbox, a cupped hand to feed flame into wick. The closest lantern bloomed, then the next. Light traveled not as a shout, but a secret passed hand to hand. Within a minute, the courtyard had its face back. Conversations resumed in a key lower than before. Across the room, the Sheikh watched, weighing skill against rumor, outcome against intent. Khalid did not move toward Amina. He did something harder and more costly. He remained where he was and let other eyes find their new conclusion without being told which one to choose. Later, under a sky fretted with small stars, Khalid stood at the edge of the pool, hands folded behind his back. He did not call her. She brought a tray anyway, water beading on glass, 3 dates, a slice of pear like a curved moon on porcelain. "Pear bruises," he said softly. "I have remembered mine," he answered. "It showed," she said. They stood without speaking while the fountain lifted silver and let it fall. The quiet between them did not ask for more, which is how you know it is true. Before sleep, Amina returned to her small room and the notes by her mirror. She added another on scrap, torn from a disused ledger. "When the lights go, count your steps before you count your fears." She slid it under the first 2. Paper remembers. The next day came not as reprieve but as reward that looked like work. A report from the Emir's office praised staff responsiveness without naming the staff. The protocol officer's list of routes returned stamped with a version of consent that said more about the stamp than the list. Kareem, reassigned to the date groves, sent a basket of unripe fruit with a scrap of apology tucked among the stems. Mariam claimed it before anyone else could, peeled what could be peeled, sugared what could be sugared, and set a small dish by Amina's plate without comment. Near dusk, a visitor arrived unannounced. A cousin with influence, the sort who calls advice a favor and debt friendship. He carried news like a man pockets coins, by sound. The house absorbed the words and decided not to digest them. Khalid convened a brief meeting that night in the library. He did not discuss Amina. He discussed standards. He did not mention rumor. He named work. When a counselor suggested that moving a single piece could settle multiple games, Khalid's gaze found the window and stayed there until the counselor flushed. "We do not move people to ease our fear," he said. After the meeting, he stepped into the colonnade alone. The desert had cooled to the temperature of kept promises. Amina approached from the far side, not by design, but by the math of 2 people who live in the same sentence. They stopped at a distance that did not force either of them to pretend. "I am learning the doors," he said, a continuation of a thought from another day. She asked. "I will not mistake one for the other," he answered. She did not touch him. He did not reach for her. The restraint had the ferocity of prayer. In the servant's wing, a new note waited under her door. Not Mariam's sharp hand, not Khalid's disciplined one. Someone else, careful and anonymous. Some shadows belonged to friends. The paper was cheap, the words steady. Amina smiled, and the smile reached the part of her that had been bracing for too long. The moon rose fattening toward roundness. In the mews, a falcon twitched beneath his hood, tasting air with a thought. In the blue salon, the water lilies closed their faces for the night. The palace, for the first time in many nights, did not hold its breath. It trusted the air. And somewhere in the soundless arithmetic of the desert, a balance shifted by a grain, enough to tilt what must tilt when dawn decides whether to arrive gentle or armed.